Well, welcome. Nice to see you, Phil. Welcome to Cafe CLIL.
Nice to see you, Keith. Welcome.
30 years
Yeah.
on.
I've seen you since then, but you know.
Yeah, well, you and I see each other quite a lot, but actually the idea of this, us meeting and having a discussion like this is quite timely, isn't it? Because it is 30 years since CLIL was invented and 10 years since the book we co-wrote came out, putting CLIL into practice. So, it's a good time.
Yes, that's right. It's a journalistic opportunity kind of thing, isn't it? I mean, but it does kind of make sense, and I think that also some people who think clear is a new thing, it can perhaps take away that idea a little bit, and also people who are new to the profession, of course. Obviously people are constantly new to the profession, so but it is worth saying that the acronym was invented 30 years ago, and indeed putting CLIL into practice was 10 years ago. My God, is it that
Mm.
long?
I mean, if you think about it, we have been coming back to what CLIL is quite a lot. And what would you say is new today? What if you were going to explain to somebody what CLIL is, how would you do it to make it a little bit different from what we've already been doing for 30 years?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and inevitably over 30 years, I was first introduced to the acronym in 1997 in at a conference in Lancaster, in England, where I actually met David Marsh there as well. And I said, "Oh, I didn't know I was doing CLIL. I'd been working on a content-based project with the Basque government, and I'd got some stuff to put up on a poster. I wasn't presenting at a conference, and going back all that time, it's inevitable that one's views evolve, but it's not that one's views evolve, it's because the thing itself evolves now, obviously. And
Yeah.
so my own, I suppose, my own evolution, I think, has just been to try to keep it simple and say, actually, it's not a branch of language teaching and it's not a branch of subject teaching. It's actually just education. It's a form of education, and perhaps everybody should be doing it, which sounds a little bit extreme, but I think we can justify that. I think it's a form of education,
Yeah.
and I'll get onto the idea of the frog in a moment, but I'll let you say what you
Yeah,
want.
well, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. We have had the idea before that all teachers are language teachers, and for me, I think all teachers are CLIL teachers. They may just not be aware of it because it's all about concepts, procedures, and language.
Precisely. I just mentioned the frog there. I came up with that because of a picture that a student had drawn for me about what they thought a CLIL teacher looked like, and I've used it ever since. And because the frog, of course, is amphibian and therefore takes on this content, this language idea, this sort of hybrid kind of teacher. And why I try to demystify this idea of CLIL. Yeah, what is CLIL? And you say, well, look, it's uh, content teachers, subject teachers become more aware of how language works in their discipline, and language teachers become more aware of how content works, of how the shape of content works, because both those teachers, as it were, those monothematic teachers, if you like, or monopedagogic teachers, I'm looking for a phrase there,
Yeah.
are not trained to think like that. They're not trained to think in that hybrid way. And so, as you say quite rightly, if you bring the two together, surely you're talking about good practice. You're talking about good education.
I mean, you also the naturally language teachers are going to stress language. That's what they're paid to do. Naturally, subject teachers are going to teach their content. But if they're familiar with the CLIL approach, it gives them a new perspective on how they do what they do, I think, because they may be able to focus a little bit more on the way they do things, the procedures of how they do things. And also for language teachers, to take some of the concepts that are in the content curriculum and work with them to develop language in their classrooms. It's there to do.
Yeah, and I think that also would help at this moment to look at that as a historical perspective of CLIL, because I think that David Marsh and the people who originally began it, I don't think they meant it necessarily to be a language teaching thing. They meant it as a support system for subject teachers. And if you go back to where CLIL came from those content-based movements in the 70s and 80s in the States, in Canada, etc. You know, that they were looking very much at school education in general. They weren't just looking at language education, but what they were looking at was, as you say, language education within subject teaching. Now, so what they basically were doing was they were saying, what is the power, what is the influence of language on cognition?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and you've got cognition is a transversal concept, of course. No? So a content teacher, a subject teacher, gets to see, without becoming an expert in language, they just get to see that by making language more visible, they improve their teaching and they enhance it. And
Yeah.
but language teaching has come in more historically a little bit later, and so into CLIL. And so, as you just said there again, the language teacher, as a process of professional development, also gets to see how content works as well, you know, because if you go into a content lesson, if you go into a subject lesson, it's a very different beast from a language class.
Yeah.
Not a better one or a worse one, but it's a very different thing, isn't it? And so
Yeah.
that hybrid coming together of those two things is hugely important. That's what
It
CLIL's
is.
given us.
I mean, you and I, before we started this meeting, we talked a lot about keeping it simple and explaining the dimensions, for example. And it's worth recapping that while we're going on with this discussion now, that in our book, Putting CLIL into Practice, we focus on three dimensions. We place equal weight, really, that can be moved of each of these three dimensions: concepts, procedures, and language. And I think the image was your idea of the music mixing board, that teachers can raise or lower the volume of either of these, or all, or any of these dimensions. I think it's still valid. But one question about those three dimensions, that it might be interesting to hear you say something, is you've been writing and talking recently about attitudinal skills.
Mm.
Would you like to say a little bit about that? It's a fourth dimension, actually, that we're moving into, and I'm interested to see what you say about it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think that it looks like in education everything always comes in threes, doesn't it? But it doesn't matter if it extends to four. I think you don't want to extend it to 55 dimensions because teachers would just panic, wouldn't they? But I do think that that there are four dimensions, and that's been quite a natural, again, evolution of my thinking in that. And we did indeed. Use CLIL, putting CLIL into practice, the Oxford book, we did use that three-dimensional thing as a sort of leitmotif
Yeah.
of running through the book. We did try to ask Oxford University Press, if you remember at the time, to call it the Holy Trinity, but they said that might be a problem in terms of sales, and of course they were quite right. So we kept it at the title. But I think since 2015, and it's a significant date, I think, because in the last 10 years, last 10, 15 years, there's been this growth of competence-based frameworks in European education.
Yeah.
Whether they're carried out or not, they do exist. You can't find a European curriculum now. I'll challenge you to find one that does not say it's not competence-based, that it's not a competence-based framework. Some do it better than others. Some do it more strongly than others. And it's not just Europe, of course. There are other countries outside of Europe that do it. I'm not suggesting it's Europe exclusive. But when you take a competence-based framework, attitudes become fundamental. So in the past, if you remember at school, you'd get half a mark added to your mark on the register at the end of term for being a good boy or a good girl, but it's not about that anymore. I've realized that if you work through competencies, and CLIL, again, I've written about that as well, that CLIL is a good conduit into competence. It's no good conduit for competence. If
Yeah.
you if you talk about competencies, you cannot subtract attitude from that, because it depends how you work, but most competence-based education will at some point, and at most points actually, use group work. So it's not a question of a choice of group work. It's group work is fundamental. So when you look at group work, the attitude towards group work becomes also something you can describe. You can write descriptors for this. And so
Okay.
writing descriptors for attitudes, people used to say in the past you couldn't assess attitudes. What they meant was you can't assess people's opinions as students. If a student wants to be homophobic or racist, they can be. Okay. But I would say no. I would say that you can assess a student's ability to formulate an opinion. You can assess a student's ability to respect somebody's opinion. The whole point about opinions in class. I mean, surely this is the sort of thing we want to do. You can assess students on the preparation that they put into a presentation with their peers. Blah blah blah. I could go on for hours, Keith, but there's no way
So
anymore.
I
You can't take that dimension away.
it might be something. I mean, how we've started, and I'm grateful that you agreed that we could get this on the road and start. We can move to, uh,
Yeah.
for example, attitudinal skills. Look at the separate skills. Look at, hopefully people will write some questions as well, and we'll pick up ideas from there. But we can come back to some of these big themes at other times. One thing you asked me about before we started was, has my experience with my school, with Anglia School,
Yeah.
changed the way I think about CLIL? And it's actually coincidental that we started with my daughter and some of her friends when she was 3 years old. She's 18 now. And over that period, Anglia School has had all ages, but our key group is very young learners and young learners. And I would say they all come for English. They don't come for anything else, really. Their parents want them to learn English, but I would call it a CLIL school. And if you ask me to clarify what I mean by that, I would say we teach skills. We don't just teach language. We teach language by learning skills, by teaching our children skills. So if you were to visit a lesson, you would find children observing things. They would be pulling things apart and having a look at the component bits and pieces of an apple, say. They would be using their own senses to describe the
Yeah.
things that they're observing and naming.
Yeah.
They would be testing things. They would be describing processes. They would be looking at cause and effect. And we do this with 2-year-olds, because my feeling is all of the kind of, let's call it peripheral language, conversational language comes. We don't need a curriculum that teaches these children a very sort of lexical, grammatical approach to language. It all comes. We plan everything through the skills. We do have vocabulary lists. We do have organized approaches to grammar within those skills, but the skills are central to everything we do. And I would say that's what CLIL is for language teachers.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and of course I always look at your stuff, and you know that I'd taken that picture of yours from Facebook, from your Anglia school, where where there's 6 kids sitting around a recycled tire, an old tire.
Thank you.
It's got soil in it, and I mean, I'm so glad you put that up. I still never actually asked you if it's right what I said about it, but it doesn't matter. I don't want you to tell me in a sense, but looking at that picture and those kids and looking at their ages, they're all preschool kids. It's obvious that what you're doing there, first of all, is you're reducing massively the abstraction of conceptual knowledge to them. Okay, I think the oldest kid there is about 6, and so they don't have. They speak fluent Bulgarian, but their ability to understand abstract concepts is still limited in their own native language. So if you're trying to teach them through English,
Yeah.
then the more it's just for me it's standard primary practice. And a lot of people often said to me, but you can't do CLIL in primary, can you, Phil? And I said, well, actually, if you look at CLIL in primary school, it really conforms much more to the principles of CLIL than it does anywhere else. Well, sorry, that's a bit strong. But then again, if you look at vocational education, it does because it's hands-on. Vocational education is working really well in CLIL in various countries. Why? Because it's much more hands-on.
Hands-on, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what people tend to forget about when they move into secondary. They think, yes, now they're in the abstraction stage. They can handle abstract concepts. Well, of course they can, but CLIL teaches us, I think, to do what you're doing in the Anglia school, and obviously, those are developmental stages, and the way that you do them, it's just great what you're
There's
doing.
an aspect of what you've mentioned before, the term, the shape of content, which I found quite interesting because
Yeah,
I talk about I talk about spaces that we create in our classes in Anglia School.
yeah,
And
I'm interested by what you mean by that. Yeah,
those
yeah,
spaces where, everything comes together. Now that might be as simple as a craft activity that's done on a piece of paper, or we've got a stage that we built out of a shoebox and things happen in that space.
But you don't mean it in that sort of Montessori sense of having different spaces in a classroom where you go
No,
to do
I
different
think
things.
it could be any space, but it's a planned space where you get the children to engage with the concepts, procedures, and language.
Yeah.
And we do it with drama bags, we do it with drama boxes, we do it with posters, we do it with scrunched up paper that represents a mountain that has a bear going over it, in a rhyming situation. It's the physical space that allows us to get the repetition, meaningful language repetition with our children through those spaces. And interestingly, with colleagues from the CLIL unit in the Ministry of Education in Cyprus, they visited my school a couple of times, and one group came, experts and inspectors, to have a look at how we do things. And they brought us another space. It was actually a recording wall with little pockets in it, and every pocket had a chip with a button, so you could put images or text in those pockets, and the kids could record themselves. Spaces like that. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of planning to create new spaces, as you can imagine. But my school is full of these tidy boxes that are full of these created spaces. I've got a manager who's an artist, and I try and encourage her as much as possible, Deanna, to do art because of the space element that she naturally exploits in getting children to learn skills, mixing colors or in describing images. I mean, she did one very good example when it was the Da Vinci 500 years celebrating since he died. And in that week, Deanna did a whole week on the masterpieces. Even with our 2 to 3 year olds, they were making collages of the Mona Lisa with tissue paper, and they were looking at texture and looking at colors combining on that space. And so that's what I mean by space. It could be anything, and I'm always looking for new ones.
Yeah.
Whether it's images or boxes or shapes or whatever.
What I would say there, and again, another question I would ask you is that often when it's very interesting talking about very young learners. I'm not an expert with very young learners, but I mean I've seen it, I've done it a bit. But I mean, what's interesting is that when people talk about CLIL, they say, "Oh God," but I mean that's going to be far too difficult linguistically for them. And in fact, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? Because if you look at, I can just go back to that tire that you placed on that photograph. What I've done is I've used that at all sorts of levels of training. I've used that at high levels of training with students who are, looking at CLIL in an academic sense. And I've just said to them, what is the teacher going to make visible here? And so I get them to think, going back to the dimensions, I say, right, what's the concept here? This is obviously an English language class these kids are teaching. You can see in the background that you've got that library with those English books. And I said, well, what's going on here? And of course, I said, just tell me what the concepts are. And they discuss it and they come out. They usually say something like, well, they want the kids to know how plants grow. And I say, yeah, I reckon that's what it is, and then we kind of try to formulate that objective more academically. I say, well, how do you think they do it?
Yeah.
And then they speculate about that. And I say, yeah, because that's the procedural content. The procedural content. This teacher has thought about this. This teacher has hauled this tire into this room. This has been set up way before the kids get in this classroom. It's not easy. And so the teacher's been thinking very strongly about the procedures here. And because the procedures with young kids are very important. But after we've discussed all that and they tell me what they think, I say, so what's the language? Now, if they're language students, they get it very quickly. Subject teachers also get it, but they get it in a different way. But what's interesting is that you can say, right, if I ask you to write me down 10 verbs that you think will appear in this class,
Absolutely.
10 nouns that will appear in this class, and I think the youngest kid in that class looks like he or she is about three or four, and obviously their Bulgarian native language is not developed
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
sense,
I mean, I
but
would say,
you can make that language visible, Keith. You can make it visible, and you can start to. What I'm saying is that that's the stage. Now, what you're doing is you're little by little, those kids will actually start getting what we call academic language.
They do. I mean, I would
Academic
say at that
research.
age, the difference is obviously not going to be in text form. We we use rhymes. There are very nice rhymes that go with planting seeds,
Yeah,
watering them, caring for them, watching them grow, and so on. I'm even doing a bit of the dance that we do with those children. But the I think the crucial thing is it's planned, it's recycled language. So the life cycle of a plant is very similar in nouns and verbs to other life cycles. So if you can plan for that to happen strategically throughout the curriculum, it's a very good way for children to develop their curriculum language because it happens naturally, you know? I mean, one thing about the plants in the planter, those children that you have in that image had seedlings bought. So they were planting bought seedlings, but we also have activities where they sprout seedlings from seeds.
yeah,
They create window greenhouses structures with units of measurement and tissue
exactly.
paper in the bottom, so they can go back every lesson and have a look at how that sprouted seed is getting on over time. And I bring our discussion to the curriculum, what the curriculum guidelines say about this. And I can say with some authority that it's very detailed because we examined the Cypriot preschool curriculum specifically for what the expectations are for science. So preschoolers in Cyprus are expected to do certain things. And
Yeah,
part of that is observe the life cycle of a plant
yeah,
according to what conditions they're kept in. And children have to do exactly that. Plant seeds, sprout seeds, plant the seedlings, water them, give them sunlight, maybe even restrict the sunlight to make observations about the consequences of all that. It's a very dense curriculum. But I'm happy about that in a way because it means that we can then guide teachers. Now, I mean, I don't get my teachers to sit down and read a curriculum, Phil, but what I'm trying to do in my interactions with them and saying to my manager, oh, do your artwork, please. Can you get them to do a bit of this? Can you, if when you're doing a week on Jamaica, have a look at combining Jamaican colors in your artwork and all of these things that she will do quite naturally, but the children will be learning curriculum skills
mhm,
where they are learning process language,
yeah.
cyclical language, and mixing color language.
Well, that's where I was going to come in because the kids are learning, and but what I think that the teacher is learning if they're doing that sort of stuff, and if they're doing it right through school, there's no reason why you can't do that in secondary as well. And of course, it depends on the subject. Obviously, some subjects are more naturally hands-on than others. But what's interesting there is that getting the teachers to be aware of how the different procedures, and we said this before this session, of how the different procedures, particularly not simply the concepts, how the different procedures will impact on the linguistic content. So looking dimensionally again, concepts, the concepts is whatever, the procedures are, and the language is what. But we've both noticed over the years, it's interesting we agree on this, that it's often the procedural dimension which impacts more strongly on the language and the language you can identify.
I mean, you say procedural, you describe procedural skills, and I think you're in our book, Putting CLIL into Practice, the section that looks at these skills, I think you wrote that, and you go into quite a lot of detail about the differences between conceptual skills, procedural skills,
Yeah.
and linguistic skills.
Yeah.
One of the things I would say about teachers embracing those skills and nurturing those skills is the opposite is also entirely possible where teachers don't nurture those skills, but they're still teaching subjects in English as a foreign language. And part of this discussion is saying what CLIL isn't. And I think CLIL isn't an immersive classroom for the very reason that they don't really pay attention to the language during that lesson.
Mm.
Students are expected to be able to cope with the
Yeah.
language of history, for example, in English in that immersive classroom.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying to you. That I think that you know, emotional. I think immersion education often works because simply the amount of language that's being flung at the students. You know, I mean, of course,
Yeah,
that's the idea. You know, but in a sense that I also think that sometimes works as a slightly defective model, as you say, because it's not dimensional. And so I think let's just make this clear to the listeners. The idea is that those dimensions are always present. You know, conceptual concepts, procedures, and language are always present at any moment in the class. All three are all working together. But what we noticed was that good CLIL practitioners tend to turn up the volume of one of them at any particular moment, and
yeah,
that's what's so important for CLIL subject teachers, for example, who are not trained to do that. You know, they're not trained to say, hang on a minute, let's just look at the kind of language we've got in this text here. You know, this engineering text in vocational education. Let's move up a bit on the ladder. Now, let's look at this text here. It's a dense text. It's difficult. It's in English. I'm sorry about that, Dana, but let's just look at all these. What are those? What do you notice? And the teachers underline them all. Of course, they're all passives. Now, we're not asking the subject teacher there to suddenly go to the board, the whiteboard or whatever and say, this is the structure of a passive. All they're doing is they're making that visible and they're saying, this is the kind of discourse that occurs at this level in this subject. And you are going to have to understand it and you're going to have to produce it. You will produce it in German. If it was happened to be in Austria or something, you've got to produce it in German, you've got to produce it in English. And that's what life is about, I'm afraid. And so by just stopping the class and saying, look at this, you know, whatever it happens to be, you're
yeah,
helping the students on their way. You're helping them on their way to becoming professionals. Because
yeah.
to be a professional, you require a certain amount of academic language. It's
I
obvious.
mean, I would say also that things are changing. The world is changing. People's mobility is changing. And I did a visit recently to the international school in Belgrade, and I mentioned international schools because they tend to have separate threads for second language learners and native speaker learners. And
Yes.
there are bridges between these groups eventually if they get there to that level that they can join. But they have these two branches, if you like. And that school I visited was having a real challenge with new arrivals with zero English.
Yes.
You know, it wasn't a question of having a little English, zero English. And they were being very innovative with devices, simultaneously translation within lessons. And I went with CLIL to try and offer, you know, ideas to teachers who don't usually think about language so much, about what tools they could pull out of the toolbox to help them manage language with concepts in their activities, in their lessons. And I think
Yeah.
that's going to happen more and more.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because if you look at the shelter construct in the States, for example, well, there's been some very good work done. You know, if you look at it, yeah, the materials look like CLIL materials. I mean, they are in a sense, but it's not called CLIL. And but what's interesting is that because of certain you know, migration configurations in different regions of the states, they set up this shelter construct. And but I used to say, well, hang on, this is all very good, but why don't you just do CLIL anyway? You know, as you're saying, you know, if you were doing CLIL in the standard educational model, you wouldn't need the shelter construct.
I think that's exactly right. And in fact, their hands are being forced in this particular school because they've got so many. I think there were largely Chinese arrivals in Serbia that they need immediate support. You know,
Yes. Yeah. Well,
was
I don't want to annoy anybody, Keith, by what I just said. I mean, obviously, if you were to separate those students initially and also use CLIL methodology with them, then that's absolutely fine as well. What I mean is that administratively speaking, that's difficult to do in many contexts. You know, it requires money. You know, they've got money in the States, but there are other countries where that might be much more difficult to do. And so by making those teachers aware of, or the administrators, let's say the school leaders aware of CLIL methodology of CLIL approaches, then you cut
yeah,
out the need to do that. I mean,
yeah.
it's still challenging, of course,
So,
challenging. I'm
I
not
mean,
saying,
well, this is our first discussion, Phil, and as we're talking, I'm thinking of things we can offer listeners. And as a result of that visit to the international school in Belgrade, I observed lessons, I made notes on lessons. The teachers let me have their resources, and we produced the fact journal of supportive CLIL ideas
Mm.
that is available. So I'll put that in the bump when we finish, that colleagues can go and have a look. So what do you do with new arrivals with very little English, who are going in the same maths lesson as fluent speakers of English?
Well, it's a huge issue now, obviously, and no country can escape it as an issue. I mean, maybe it's a separate discussion, Keith. I mean,
Yeah, we could come back to it. I mean, we did
yeah,
say that before we started, Phil, that we wanted to pick up the general ideas today
yeah, yeah.
and clarify. Really, we're talking about concepts, procedures, and language. We haven't mentioned guiding input and supporting output yet.
No, sorry, I was going to ask
We
you that.
might come back to that as
Yeah,
well.
okay, yeah.
I think I think for like an initial meeting, I'm just looking at my watch. We said we were going to stick to 30 minutes.
How long have we been now?
We've
Is
got
it?
about a minute left,
We've got a
basically.
minute left. Well, look, well, since we've got a minute left, I do like that, and we did say we'd try and do those sort of general phrases, and I always like that phrase. Phrases that have influenced me in education, and one of them was yours, and it was guiding input and supporting output. You've got 30 seconds. Tell me, it isn't
Well,
always quick.
okay. I mentioned the shapes and the spaces that we create for our learners in Anglia School. The diagrammatical frameworks, if you like, are part of what you give learners if they have to watch a film and make notes on something, or listen to the teacher talking, have
Yeah,
some structure to allow them to follow what the teacher's saying and note something down. Similarly, with supportive scaffolds, the same structures can be embedded with language to help learners speak and write in their own words.
yeah, yeah. Basically, scaffolding. We're talking about scaffolding in the old four skill sense. Now, reading, speaking, listening,
I mean,
and
we
writing.
might make scaffolding one of the themes in the future,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you like. I mean, we're going to get notes on all of this 30 minutes, and I think that will, you and I will get back together again, and we'll put out some headings that we can look at with dates as well. If we're going to make a run
And
at it.
if somebody listens to it and writes and says, "Hey, could you talk about so and so?" Then
Why
yeah,
not? Let's do it. I
yeah.
mean, we're here for the coffee
We
and
are indeed.
and,
I'm still here. Yeah.
talking about CLIL. So let's say bye to our listeners and invite them to join us again at some point in the very near future.
Yes. Okay. Bye bye. Thanks for listening, and join us in the very near future. Thanks, Keith. Anyway.